Thank you and welcome back to our LMU Innovation Symposium. It's a pleasure to see everyone here today. I would like to now welcome to the stage Mariana Villa. She is our Associate Vice President for External Relations and Partnerships, who will introduce some very important folks to you guys today. So, Mariana.
Thank you, Nola. Welcome. As she said, my name is Mariana Villa, and I'm the Vice President for External Relations and Partnerships. What an exciting day today has been. The dialogue, the thought leadership, and the chance to be together in person. I'm grateful to my colleagues in the College of Business Administration for their partnership in orchestrating our first ever LMU Innovation Symposium. Dean Dale Smith, Nola Wanta, Kala Seal, Anna Mangala, and I'm looking forward to so many more collaborations with this dream team. Also, Tim O'Neill, the behind-the-scenes expert who pulls this all together for us. Thank you. It's my honor to get the next part of the program started with an introduction of Tom Poon, LMU Provost. Provost Poon joined LMU in 2017. As Provost, he leads the Academic Affairs and Student Affairs divisions, including overseeing the university's educational, scholarly, creative activities, student development, and enrollment management areas. He's also a tenured professor in chemistry. Provost Poon earned his PhD in chemistry at UCLA and his Bachelor of Science at Fairfield University, a Jesuit school. His ability to tend to our institution has helped us emerge from the pandemic stronger than ever, allowing for us to be back together in person for things like today. Please join me in welcoming Provost Poon.
Thank you, Mariana. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? That's great. Well, at long last, I am honored to welcome you all to LMU's Playa Vista campus for the LMU Innovation Symposium presented by our College of Business, Administration, and External Relations. And I want to thank our panelists. I heard we had some amazing panels earlier today. And so I'm going to thank from the collaboration between academia and industry to train future leaders panel, Rick Geringer, CIO of Wedgwood, Lucas Pierce, Director of Data at Snap, Abhishek Rath, Senior Global Engagement Manager, AWS ProServe, M&E, and Ray Toll, Professor and Chair, LMU Department of Computer Science. How about a round of applause for those panelists? And from the Organizational Values and Ethics in Technology and Analytics panel, we have Nima Datkaniku, Product Manager at Google, Sumjita Mitra, Chief Economist, California Department of Finance, Chris Stern, Managing Director for Trimble Ventures. How about a round of applause for those panelists? Thank you all. So I've been waiting for tonight's conversation since I first heard about it, since Mariana first told me that we got John Carreyrou, and that was in February of 2020. Unbelievable. So much, as you know, has changed since then, but the unbelievable story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos continues to deliver on so many levels that tonight's discussion is more relevant than ever. And now you might be asking, what does a story of deception, the biggest corporate fraud since Enron have to do with innovation? What's it have to do with LMU? Well, the better question is, what role does LMU have in preventing such stories of deception and instead in facilitating innovations and real ones that change lives? Today, we have brought together industry and academic experts from multiple disciplines to discuss how innovations in technology, data, ethical decision-making, and strategies have an impact on people, the planet, and of course, profit. Now, our Innovation Symposium exemplifies the ways in which we at LMU, our students, faculty, staff, and alumni, synthesize meaning and purpose in life-changing ways. And indeed, our mission infuses our innovations, our creations, and our scholarship. Our service of faith awakens us to multiple perspectives, it opens our minds, and equips us with a superpower, ethical discernment. This is at the heart of all that we do at LMU. Which brings me to tonight's moderators, ethical discerners through and through. Kate Picker is Assistant Professor of Journalism in our Bellarmine College of the Liberal Arts, where she has taught a health journalism class devoted to John Carreyrou's coverage of Theranos and how the media seeks to portray its story subjects as heroes and prodigies. From 2008 to 2015, Professor Picker was a staff writer at Time magazine and a freelance magazine writer and newspaper reporter before that. Professor Picker has taught journalism at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at USC. Professor Picker is the author of Radical, The Science, Culture, and History of Breast Cancer in America. Jeff Fees is a clinical assistant professor in our Department of Management at the College of Business Administration. He has held executive management positions in direct mail marketing and healthcare industries, developing leadership, formation, and professional development programming for these organizations. Prior to joining LMU full-time, Jeff worked in the area of applied ethics as a mission integration executive, most recently serving as vice president of the Leadership Institute for St. Joseph Health in Irvine, California. In that role, he oversaw system initiatives which focused on individual and organizational values, the formation of those values, as well as training in clinical and, most appropriately, organizational ethics. Well, whether you know it or not, you are already familiar with our keynote speaker's investigative reporting. In his New York Times best-selling and totally absorbing book, Bad Blood, John Carreyrou meticulously shares the story of the incomprehensible rise and collapse of Theranos, the one-time multi-billion-dollar Silicon Valley company that rose to fame with the promise of blood testing technology that never existed. Of course, there's also a marvelous HBO documentary, several podcasts. I think the best one, Bad Blood, The Final Chapter, hosted by Carreyrou, and countless articles, if not penned by Carreyrou, deeply influenced by his work, to say the least. Carreyrou won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting with several colleagues for a series of articles exposing fraud and abuse in Medicare. Early in his career, he was also part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for its coverage of corporate scandals. For his extensive coverage of Theranos, Carreyrou was awarded the George Polk Award for financial reporting, the Gerald Loeb Award for distinguished business and financial journalism in the category of beat reporting, and the Bartlett and Steele Silver Award for investigative business journalism. Bad Blood was also named the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year. Please join me in welcoming John Carreyrou to LMU, finally. And with that, I invite our panelists up to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Ooh, hi. Thanks for being here. I hope there are a couple of journalism students here. As a journalist, and I see one of them in the back, as a journalist and journalism professor, John, we're so thrilled to have you here to talk about your work. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Provost Poon gave just a tidbit of the Theranos story. There's one of my students. For the few people here who may not know the story of the rise and fall of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, I wondered, John, even though you've done a podcast, a book, dozens and dozens of stories, a Loeb Award, a Polk Award, all of the work that you've done, it may be hard to summarize this story, but I wondered if you might try and just briefly explain sort of the rise and fall, and then how you first got on the story yourself.
Okay, I'll try to do that in a few sentences. So Theranos is a Silicon Valley startup that was founded in late 2003 by a young woman named Elizabeth Holmes, who was a Stanford dropout. She was 19 at the time. She dropped out of her sophomore year at Stanford with a vision, which originally was a sort of a bracelet that was going to diagnose your ailments and almost simultaneously inject you with drugs to cure whatever was ailing you. And she went out and pitched this idea, started to raise money, and the idea pivoted from that to something a little bit more less science fiction-y and a little bit more realistic, which was a semi-portable machine akin to the blood glucose monitors that diabetes patients use, except it wasn't going to do much more than measuring blood sugar. It was going to do all the blood tests from a pinprick of blood pricked from a finger. And that became sort of the vision and the calling card of Theranos. And over the ensuing 10 years, Elizabeth was able to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, when all was said and done, it was about $1 billion that she raised. And her company, Theranos, reached a valuation of $10 billion at its peak. And back then, if you remember, this was 2013, late 2013, early 2014. It was for a brief few weeks, if not a couple months, the most valuable startup in all of Silicon Valley, because Uber and Spotify and some of these other gigantic startups, weren't as valuable yet. Anyways. Come 2015, Elizabeth has become something of a celebrity, especially in Silicon Valley. She's gracing the covers of magazines, being hailed as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. She's managed to keep half of the stock of her company for herself, so she's worth about $5 billion at that point. And to answer your other question, how did I come onto the story? I read a profile of her in The New Yorker, written by a New Yorker writer named Ken Auletta, and that story left me with a lot of questions. I'd been writing, I'd been doing investigative reporting, mainly healthcare focused, for 10 years at that point, so I had a lot of experience with this stuff. And to summarize my reaction, I was pretty skeptical right off the bat reading that story, the secrecy, the lack of peer-reviewed publications, the lack of explanation for how her great innovation supposedly worked. And that said, I read the story on the subway commuting back from Manhattan to Brooklyn, where I live, and probably forgot about it by the time I walked home from my subway stop in Brooklyn, and probably wouldn't have done anything more with it if it weren't for the fact that a couple weeks later I got a call from a source who was a pathologist in the Midwest who'd read the very same New Yorker story and had been even more skeptical than I had been, since he knew a lot more about blood testing than I did. And he told me that he smelled a story and that I should look into it. And at that point, he'd made some contacts with people who weren't primary sources, but had some contact with Elizabeth over the years, who were very skeptical of her claims, and that's what got the ball rolling.
Yeah, I wanted you to start with that because I think one of the things that's most remarkable about the Theranos Elizabeth Holmes story is that you were sort of out there on your own for a long time at the beginning, and you really stood out from the pack of other folks who had been writing about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. So reading other people's work, which is really important, and then getting a tip, right? Can be the beginning of something.
Right, and the coverage that came before I started digging into the company had been extremely positive. Although, ironically, the Ken Auletta story, which was the last big sort of journalistic expose or profile that was published before I started digging in, did include some skeptical passages, did highlight some things that were important. The lack of peer-reviewed studies included a sort of ham-handed, almost childish-sounding quote from her about her technology worked. And so, as I later explored in my recent podcast, I think I might not have been able to get the story if Ken Auletta hadn't met with her a bunch of times for his New Yorker story and hadn't, begun to explore some of the issues that I then ran with.
Yeah, I think Ken Auletta described sort of her explanation of the technology as comically vague, right?
That's right.
Which was a red flag for any journalist who would read that. So yeah, I wanted to ask you actually about the media coverage that Elizabeth got before, because as you mentioned, she had been on a number of magazine covers, including Fortune, and had gotten this really glowing media coverage that in retrospect was, I think, probably quite irresponsible, or at least missed the mark, missed something. And so I wanted to ask you, I guess, also from an ethical standpoint, do you think that the news media played a role in sort of Elizabeth's, that company getting to that valuation and sort of the legend kind of growing over time?
Yes. I mean, undoubtedly, yes, it did. And, people like Roger Parloff, who I've come to know, he was the writer of the Fortune magazine cover story, which is arguably the piece that really cemented her as a celebrity and an up-and-coming, quote-unquote genius. He, clearly was probably too gullible, didn't ask some of the right questions. I will say, though, in his defense and in Ken's defense, and in the defense of several other journalists, including Joe Rago, who is the first mainstream journalist who ever wrote about Elizabeth Holmes, ironically for the Wall Street Journal, for the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal back in September of 2013. What I'll say in their defense is that she lied to all of them. In fact, I was talking a lot to Ken Auletta in the fall when I was working on my podcast, and I went over with him in detail all the lies that she told him. And he was furious, but he also was taken aback. Even with everything that's come out, he didn't realize all the details, all the detailed ways in which she had lied to him. And so, yes, the press is at fault, and these journalists, some of these journalists believe the hype too much. But I do think that she misled some of these reporters in a very premeditated way. And the timing of some of these stories was also completely orchestrated by her to suit her fundraising needs. She arranged via George Shultz, who had a good relationship with Paul Gigot, the editorial page editor at the Wall Street Journal, to be interviewed in the op-ed pages of the Journal right before she went back to raise money, and right before they announced the Walgreens partnership. And so she timed some of these interviews in which she made these very misleading claims, to suit her purposes. And so I don't like to. I think it's clear that the press did play a role, but I don't like to blame some of these journalists too much, because I really do think they were incredibly misled, and that they probably hadn't come across during their career someone who lied so willingly.
Yeah, it's hard to guard against someone directly lying to your face.
On the record.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I've always thought that covering Silicon Valley as a journalistic beat is challenging in a lot of ways. You're covering a place and a culture that is really shrouded in secrecy, a lot of times for good reason. There's a lot of proprietary information, there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of money. And so I think that beat in particular can be tricky. I wondered, could you talk a little bit about sort of the Silicon Valley culture of kind of secrecy and proprietary information and how that creates challenges and opportunities for journalists?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just, I would say what characterizes Silicon Valley's culture is not just secrecy and competition, it's also hyping and exaggerating. And in some ways, all of those are defendable. If you're an entrepreneur, you need to sell people on your vision. You need to sell, employees and get them excited to join your project and to come to work every day. You need to sell investors and convince them that even if it's just a vision, you're going to implement it, and you need to convince them to part with their money. So there's an incredible amount of salesmanship that has to go into being an entrepreneur. In Silicon Valley, there's the secrecy because some of the innovations are proprietary and have to be protected. And so understandably, a lot of companies use non-disclosure agreements. There's a lot of competition for the money. I mean, it's been a gusher of money, basically, the past 15, 20 years. This, what I call the second tech boom. Arguably, we're in the third now with blockchain. It's hard to keep track. But it is, if you're a journalist, it is challenging. You have to discern, what is exaggeration and hype. One thing I'll say is that I've seen the tone of the coverage change tremendously in the last 5-6 years. When I came out with my first story and my first set of stories about Theranos, it was a different time. There was a lot more willingness among the tech press and the general press too, because some of the reporters we mentioned earlier weren't necessarily tech reporters. Roger Parloff and Ken Auletta worked for very much mainstream publications. There was more willingness to take what some of these entrepreneurs were saying at face value, and there was a willingness to buy into the hero and the genius narrative and to the cult of the founder narrative. That's changed a lot. I think the Theranos scandal has played a role in that, but not just the Theranos scandal. There's the wayward way in which Facebook and Twitter were used during the 2016 elections, the litany of smaller scandals that there have been since, and I feel like coverage is now a lot more balanced and discerning of Silicon Valley than it was. I think people in the Valley get away with a lot less than they used to. That's probably a good thing, but unfortunately, I don't think that some of the main characteristics that I was talking about earlier have really completely disappeared or disappeared at all. I think fake it till you make it is still very much part of the DNA of Silicon Valley, and the Elizabeth Holmes story is the illustration of the bad things that it can lead to.
I think it's safe to say, John, that you're probably your coverage of Theranos and what happened as a result of that, I'm sure, had a huge influence on the tech press and folks covering Silicon Valley. So I think that there were lessons learned by a lot of folks, including journalists, I think, from that debacle. I'm just going to ask one more thing, and then I'm going to throw it to Jeff here. So I just listened to your podcast, Bad Blood, the Final Chapter, which Provost Poon mentioned, which is really fantastic and riveting. And there's lots of audio from, there's some audio in the podcast of Ken Auletta, the New Yorker journalist, interviewing Elizabeth Holmes, which you very rarely, as a member of the public, get to hear a journalist interviewing someone, and she lies in the interview, and it's quite remarkable to hear sort of Auletta's attempt to get stuff out of her and her sort of evasiveness. So the podcast is great, but one of my favorite parts as a journalist of the podcast is audio from a meeting that you had at the Wall Street Journal offices. I think it was you and an editor and a general counsel from the Journal, along with David Boies, who's a very well-known litigator who Elizabeth had hired to represent Theranos and basically to go to the Journal to try to intimidate you out of publishing, I think, your first story. And you describe him in the podcast as being like a grizzly bear with gnarled teeth or something like that. So if you have a lawyer like David Boies in your face yelling at you that you're wrong and you're going to go down in flames with a big lawsuit if you publish a story, it could intimidate a lesser journalist. And so I wondered sort of how you kept your cool through all of the pressure that was placed on you, especially before the first story, but I'm sure throughout your reporting on the company.
Yeah, that meeting took place in late June of 2015, and so I had been reporting the story for about 4 or 5 months by then, and I felt like reached a critical mass. So, yes, it was very intimidating, and it was a momentous meeting, but I had done enough reporting that I felt that I was on the right track. I mean, regarding the science, one of the first things I did when I started reporting the story is I reached out to the chairs of pathology departments at big universities, one of them being on this coast, UCSF, and the vice chair of the pathology department at UCSF told me, I think, during our first conversation about the finger prick technology that Elizabeth claimed to have invented, that he'd be less surprised if someone told him that they'd traveled back in time from the 27th century than if she had really achieved what she claimed to have achieved, in terms of that small sample testing. And then he went into the details of why he felt that way. And so I felt on very strong ground about the science. I had very good sources. I mean, probably the best source you can have in this situation, the former head of the laboratory, the Theranos laboratory, who would explain to me in detail, what the machine could do and what it couldn't do and the ways in which they'd hacked these third-party analyzers. And then I had Tyler and Erica, among others, corroborating what he told me. So I didn't reach a point. This meeting, by the way, with David Boies and his henchmen went on for 5 hours. It was surreal. But there was never a point where I felt like they were kind of, shaking my conviction. If anything, as it went on, and it got more and more surreal, and it was kind of, I think in the book, I described it as a theater of the absurd sort of play. The more they were stonewalling, and the more they were stonewalling in ways that were just ridiculous, the more I felt like I was on the right track. And so, that was an important, pivotal meeting, but in some ways, it left me even more convinced and determined that I was on the right track, and that that we were going to go forward with the story. Although, one last thing I'll say is that the story didn't get published for another, I think, June, July, August, September, 3.5 months. And so Boies and Elizabeth, with her legal threats, did succeed in kind of slowing down the vetting and the editing process on the Journal's end.
Just delaying the inevitable. Yeah, right. And I'm going to throw it to Jeff, but I'm dying to know if you slept the night that the story went to press, that first one. But I'll throw it to Jeff, and we can talk later. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon. And the ethical issues, the business ethical issues, there's just so many of them. Patient fraud, investor fraud, failures of corporate governance, corrosive and toxic work cultures, the role of the whistleblower. I mean, there's just so many pieces to this. As you look at this and your experience with this and living with this, what stands out to you as the key ethical issues or maybe ethical lessons that you would highlight?
Well, I think that the main thing here that's at fault is this one trait of the Silicon Valley culture, which is the fake it until you make it aspect of the culture. Elizabeth, when she dropped out of Stanford, she was 19. She knew the Silicon Valley lore well. She already had begun to idolize Steve Jobs. She, shortly after dropping out, through one of her early champions, Don Lucas, she met Larry Ellison. She knew how these tech founders had behaved in their early days, and she felt that she was entitled to behave the same way. And namely, if you look back at Jobs' early career, before even they founded Apple, he got hired by Atari, and one anecdote is that he was asked to program a video game, and he outsourced the project to Steve Wozniak, who did it in a couple days, and then Jobs got paid for it and got a bonus, and he never told Woz about the bonus, nor did he tell his superior at Atari that it wasn't his handiwork. So that's a small example to illustrate, that Jobs was doing this sort of stuff in the early days of his career. There are moments at Apple, too, where he was faking it. Ellison is the archetype of, the guy who hyped his product early on. The early database product of Oracle, was full of bugs. It was basically shouldn't have been commercialized, but it was commercialized, not as version 1, but as version 2, because he wanted to give customers the impression that this wasn't the first software program they'd written. And then when it got into the hands of customers, it was so full of bugs that early customers like the CIA would call over to Oracle headquarters to talk to programmers, and they would debug the program together, the database software together over the phone. I mean, that's how that's the shape that the early database software that Oracle shipped was in. And then Ellison was also famous for, in the years thereafter, marketing features of that software that they hadn't even begun working on. But the big difference between Ellison, there's another example of this, which is Gates, which is that when Gates and Allen were negotiating with IBM in '79 to make MS-DOS the operating system of the IBM PC, they didn't have MS-DOS, yes. They were in parallel negotiating with a computer store in Seattle to acquire that program from it. So, there are a lot of examples of this behavior in the earlier eras of Silicon Valley. I think the big difference is that all three of those guys were operating in the computer industry, and more specifically in software. And what Elizabeth either lost sight of or more likely was aware of but chose to turn a blind eye to was the fact that she wasn't in the software space, she was in the medical device space, and that her device was going to be something that, that was used by patients and doctors for very important, in some cases, life or death health decisions. And that's what I think makes the Theranos scandal as outrageous as it is. I think it's what makes people's blood boil about it, is that she was willing to take those types of risks and to experiment on patients, whereas these guys that she looked up to, such as Gates, Ellison, and Jobs, were operating in the less risky space of computers and of computer software. I mean, you can make the argument nowadays that software can also kill. The MCAS software on the Boeing 737 would be one example of that, and the autopilot software on Teslas would be another. But for the most part, when Jobs and Ellison and Gates were, in the early parts of their career, software was really confined to the computer industry. The internet didn't exist yet, and the stakes were much lower. With healthcare, as you know, the stakes are much, much higher. I'm not sure if I answered exactly your question, but...
No, you did, and I appreciate that. I was going to ask about that precisely because of the human safety dimension of that. And in your podcast, you describe how they're treating it really from the mentality of a software developer, but actually not following things like clinical trials and those kinds of protocols around human safety. There is, of course, the other thing you point out, the misrepresentation of the capability of the product when it really wasn't even a product.
Right.
And you tell the story of how they kind of jerry-rig, maybe that's the wrong word, but use third-party blood analyzers to deliver their reports when they're misrepresenting the capability of their Edison machine or the various generations that they had. One thing that you mentioned, and just curious about Elizabeth, and is this something that she intended to deceive from the beginning? And, because there is this ambition, part of the, both Silicon Valley and entrepreneurship, an ambition that becomes promotion, but in this case it became deception. Was that the sequence, or was it deceptive by design from the beginning? How did you see the decision-making process?
I think it was the former. I don't think she intended to deceive from the beginning. I don't think this was a premeditated long con, that was hatched in her mind when she dropped out of Stanford. I do think that when she dropped out, she was an ambitious, driven young woman who wanted to make a name for herself in Silicon Valley and build a successful startup. I think the lying and the corner cutting did start happening early on. I think it was an ends justify the means, sort of behavior. Elizabeth always felt that, she was pursuing a noble cause because this was a healthcare product that potentially was going to revolutionize, this corner of medicine, which is really important. As she said at the height of her fame, blood tests are the basis of 70% of medical decisions. So if you can get people to get their blood tested more often because it's only a pinprick and there's the ease of use, then potentially you have revolutionized, at least part of the healthcare system. I think she felt that cause, those goals, were so noble and defendable that the corners that she cut on the way to getting there were, justifiable and warranted. I think to this day, and until recently, before she got convicted, in her mind, she felt that the lying and the corner cutting were no big deal, and certainly not fraud.
When there's corporate scandals like this, one of the first questions that's asked is, where was the board? What was the responsibility of oversight to the board? How did the board fail to exercise its responsibility? How could they not have known these kinds of things? Could you talk a little bit about the relationship of the board and how you see governance in this story?
So there's an expression, being asleep at the switch. The board was asleep at the switch, and I mean literally asleep at the switch. There are, the people who told me these anecdotes, and I think Kissinger even admits as much in one of his interviews with Ken Auletta, although I don't think I played that excerpt on the podcast. There were moments during the board meetings where George Shultz and Henry Kissinger would fall asleep. They were in their early 90s at that point. They were also asleep at the switch figuratively. You look at the composition of the board, I think only 2 of the board members had any experience whatsoever with healthcare. One was Bill Frist, who had once upon a time been a transplant surgeon. The other was Bill Foege, the former CDC chief. Other than those 2, no one among those they're certainly very impressive people from former cabinet members, former generals. Certainly they had very impressive resumes, but they did not have any expertise in healthcare. And that is one of the ways in which she was able to keep them in the dark. They didn't really know what she was talking about. The other thing to bear in mind with Theranos is that she had passed through a resolution right as she was raising money in late 2013, right as she was going live with the blood tests, that gave her 100 votes per share she held. And so from that point on, from about Christmas of 2013 on, she held 99.7% of the voting rights. And in one of the depositions that George Shultz gives during one of the lawsuits that followed my reporting, he says that there was no point in really trying to tell Elizabeth at a board meeting what she should do, because she was always going to do what she wanted to do, because she and only she had the power to do anything. The board couldn't even reach a quorum without her. So that also explains why the board was so ineffective.
This is like peeling layers of the onion, and every layer leads into more and more questions. One final one, and from my standpoint, is the role of the whistleblower. In Tyler Schultz, the way in which both he speaks about his experience and you tell his experience, what a demonstration of moral courage, one of the things that we really try to focus here on LMU, and how to instill that sense of confidence in what's right, and then having the courage to act on what's right. And could you tell a little bit of his story, and how do you see his ability to have the moral courage that he clearly demonstrated?
Right, so for those of you not familiar with that part of the story, Tyler is the former Secretary of State George Shultz's grandson. George Shultz was on the board of Theranos. George met Elizabeth in 2011 and quickly became enamored with her and with her vision, and soon joined the board and really became her champion. And someone she used to make introductions around Silicon Valley and beyond. And after George joined the board, or around the time that he joined the board, Tyler happened to come to George's house, which is right on the Stanford campus. And he was a junior at that point at Stanford. And he met Elizabeth, and he was wowed by her, just like his grandfather was. The vision really appealed to him, and he decided that he was going to change his major from, I think it was some sort of engineering specialty, to biology, and he went and interned for Theranos that summer. And then the following summer, after he graduated from Stanford, he went to work there full time. He didn't see much during the 2 months that he was there. During that first summer internship, he didn't even see the machine. But when he went to work there full time a year later, he quickly started seeing things that he didn't think were kosher. He was part of one of the teams that validated blood tests that they started rolling out in the clinical lab being the place where they tested live patient samples collected from patients at Walgreens stores. And he was not impressed with the rigor of the validation experiments they were doing. And, he and this friend that he made, Erica, became convinced that Theranos was basically manipulating data, leaving, outliers out and so forth. And so over the course of the 8 months that he worked there, he became disenchanted. And toward the end of his stint, tried to alert his grandfather to what he was seeing, and to open his eyes to the fact that Elizabeth was lying and exaggerating. And he was unsuccessful. George basically wouldn't listen to him, just kept telling him, work it out with Elizabeth. So he finally resigned, and then, of course, he became a source of mine. When I started looking into the company in 2015, he became an anonymous source, a confidential source, but Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth were quickly able to figure out that he was one of the people talking to me, and that's when they went after him with David Boies and with legal threats. And Tyler went through a really, really difficult period, several months before my story was published. The interesting thing, what was always a bit inexplicable to me and to a lot of people who followed the story was George's behavior and the way George turned against his own blood, against his own grandson. And one of the things I learned more recently, which I revealed in one episode of the podcast, is that Elizabeth had showered George with stock. She had given him stock worth $50 million. And by all accounts, George Shultz is a wealthy man, but I think that's enough money to sway your judgment. And so I think that definitely played a role in the way George behaved. Sorry, I ended up talking more about George than about Tyler, but yes, it took a lot of courage to do what Tyler did. Ironically, one of the motivations for him during our first phone conversation, he said this to me, was that he wanted to save his grandfather's reputation, that George had made it unscathed through Watergate and through the Iran-Contra scandal, and he wanted to save him from what he felt was going to be Silicon Valley's biggest scandal by exposing it while he was still alive and giving him time to do the right thing. And unfortunately, George never really quite did the right thing.
Thank you. We want to make sure that we have the opportunity for question and answer. And so we want to invite you guys in the audience if you have any questions. Carol?
I think people are just really fascinated by Elizabeth and her psychology. Hi. I think people are really fascinated by Elizabeth Holmes and her psychology and how, you said she was charismatic, but it's just still hard to believe that she convinced so many powerful people that she had this great idea and managed to raise $1 billion. And you said even on the stand, she still retains that certain something.
Right. The first thing I would say about Elizabeth Holmes is she's very intelligent. And then I would say secondly, she's charismatic and charming. But I think what also contributed to the way in which people were, won over by her and mesmerized by her is that, as I said earlier, a big part of her was a believer in her vision. She really did want to change the world, and she really did want to bring about, this revolution in healthcare. And I think that the disconnect is that she felt she was justified in lying a lot and cutting a lot of corners to get there. But in the back of her mind, I don't think she ever gave up on achieving what she set out to achieve. And so I think that made her more believable, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I would just add on, who believes a 19-year-old, right?
Who believes what?
Who believes a 19-year-old?
Right. Well, some people did not. One of the people who didn't believe her and had reason not to believe her was Phyllis Gardner, a professor at Stanford's medical school, who Elizabeth went to see, shortly after she dropped out, with her cockamamie vision of the what was it called? It was basically the bracelet. It had Thera in the name. And Elizabeth explained to her that, what she was proposing to do was simply not possible. And that wasn't what Elizabeth wanted to hear, so she moved on from Phyllis to other advisors. I agree with you. And some people, I also for the book, I talked to a venture capitalist at a med tech firm in the Valley who had, at that point, 30 years of experience vetting medical technology ideas, and they turned her down. She was turned down by a lot of people in those early days, but through certain connections, Don Lucas being one of them, through people her parents knew, she was able to raise $6 million in that first round. And then 6 months later, another $10 million, and then another $20 million a couple of years later, and that got the ball rolling. And then, by then, she's no longer 19, she's 22, she's 23. The company, on paper, looks like it has a track record of 3 or 4 years. And then, the bulk of the money that she raised, in retrospect, was raised in from late 2013 to early 2015. That's when she raised about 750 million of the billion. And at that point, investors who were coming in looked at a startup that had been around for 10 years. And they looked at a founder who was basically 30 years old and who'd been at it for 10 years and who claimed that she had achieved these great things. And I think it was easier to believe then, especially when she was forging logos. She would show some of these investors reports that Theranos had written as part of these little pilot projects that it had done for pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer and Schering-Plough. She would share these reports, and she had forged the logo of the pharmaceutical companies onto the reports to make it seem like the pharmaceutical companies and not Theranos had written the reports. And then she claimed that the reports validated her technology. That's one of the pieces of evidence that came back to bite her at trial, and probably had a lot to do with her conviction.
Yeah, so just going back a little bit, you mentioned that Henry Kissinger was on the board. So my question is, how was Elizabeth successful in winning their confidence in the first place?
How was Elizabeth
Successful in getting their confidence in the first place, in having them in the board?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Among all those guys who made up the board at the end, all those former cabinet members and senators and congressmen and military leaders, the first guy that she managed to wrap around her finger was George Shultz, whom she met through someone on the faculty at Stanford who was a good friend of George's. And how did she convince George? George, as Tyler puts it, George never agreed to talk to me, and he's since passed away. But according to Tyler, George is someone who was always passionate about science and about what science could do for progress, for the progress of humanity. He always felt that science was going to offer solutions to problems like pandemics and global warming. And I think he was the perfect, he was also in his early 90s, so probably not as on top of things as he was earlier in his career. I think he was the perfect target for her. And then once she got him on board, through him she met all of these other, mainly friends of George's. A lot of the people who ended up on the board, like Kissinger, like Frist and Sam Nunn, and I'm forgetting some, Admiral Roughead, were all people who were fellows, senior fellows at the Hoover Institution, which is the think tank on the Stanford campus, who were there with George. So she really was able to meet all these people through George Shultz. And then once they met her, not only were they impressed with the way she presented, but they also had their good friend George Shultz, unimpeachable, vouching for her. And so I think that goes a long way toward explaining how she put together that board.
And a follow-up to that, doesn't it put everyone else's credibility at question then? For example, Mr. Kissinger in this case, being on the board?
For sure. I mean, in their defense, some of these guys were in their 90s, in the twilights of their careers and their lives. George Shultz has since passed away. I think Henry Kissinger is 100 or 101 now. But some of them should have known better. General Mattis should have known better. and yeah, it's still to this day partly inexplicable to me how some of these people who've had such great careers either asked so few questions or didn't think to ask the right questions.
We have a question back here.
Hi, my name is Rachel. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your talk. I was curious about her promise of the disruption of the market and how far you think that went in terms of investors and trust within her product.
So, like I said earlier, I think what she was proposing to do, what she claimed she'd achieved, which was, hundreds of blood tests, the 300 or 400 most important blood tests, the ones that you most commonly order, that she was able to do them from a pinprick of blood from the finger, get you the results in a couple hours with a semi-portable, machine. That truly would have been a big advance. To this day, I don't think anyone has solved that yet. You might be able to do as many as 10 tests off a drop of blood. And there are two problems with that proposition. One is that it's capillary blood, meaning blood from the finger, and so it's polluted with tissue and cells. It's not as pure as blood that you draw from a vein in the arm. There's that problem, and then there's the quantity of blood. When you're dealing with such a small quantity of blood, there are four big categories of blood tests that each require completely different laboratory instruments and methods of testing. And so if you're doing, say, a handful of blood tests off that tiny drop in one category, usually you've exhausted your sample and there's no sample left to then apply the other set of methods that you need to do, say, for the cholesterol test or the prostate cancer test. That's a problem that, and there are a lot of people working on this in academia and in industry that no one has solved, and she claimed to have solved it. So it would have been a great advance had she been telling the truth.
I guess just in terms of her investors, what kind of confidence did that just interpretation of possibly a disruption in the market provide? Was that enough confidence to invest in this without knowing the product itself?
Well, some investors certainly did not do much due diligence. Rupert Murdoch essentially called Toby Cosgrove, who he was friendly with, who was the CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, because he'd heard that Theranos was about to announce a partnership with the Cleveland Clinic. And Toby told him, yeah, Elizabeth is great. And that was about the extent of his due diligence. Other investors tried to do more due diligence. Brian Grossman, one of the principals at Partner Fund Management, which is the San Francisco hedge fund that invested about $100 million in Theranos, he asked a bunch of questions, and he was lied to in writing and orally. At one point, he insisted on seeing the lab, and Sunny Balwani, Elizabeth's boyfriend at the time, who was number 2 of the company, resisted, saying that the lab contained a lot of Theranos technology that hadn't been patented yet. That was the excuse. But Brian insisted, and eventually he was shown an area of the lab with rows of Edison machines stacked on shelves, which was completely misleading because the actual lab didn't just contain those Edison machines, it also contained third-party machines that they had hacked for small samples and other third-party machines that were unmodified that they used for venous draws. So that's just to tell you that some investors actually did ask the right questions and were outright misled and lied to. I do think the investment proposition that she and Sunny presented was a compelling one. If the technology really did what she claimed it could do, then conceivably, you could have had a Theranos quickly take market share from LabCorp and Quest. And this is a huge, I think that the annual revenues of the blood diagnostics market is like upwards of $70 billion a year, and it's mainly divvied up between these two companies. If Theranos had made real headway, if this technology worked, if the results were accurate, I think investors rightfully could have anticipated major growth in revenues and profits over the coming years that could have eventually justified the valuation. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate it.
The question I have for you, my name is Sue. I'm in the MS program in management here at LMU. In the years that you've been doing the kind of investigations that you have, do you have more or less hope that human beings are capable of letting integrity and ethical behavior be more important than greed?
I'm not overly pessimistic about that. The main question I'm focused on is whether Silicon Valley has learned any lessons from this story and from this scandal. And until recently, what I was hearing a lot in Silicon Valley was, well, actually Theranos was an outlier. It's not representative because the people who put a lot of money in were Rupert Murdoch and Betsy DeVos. None of them were these sophisticated VC firms in the Valley. They knew to stay away. That's actually not quite true. Sequoia tried to show some interest and via a former board member, and was told that Theranos wasn't interested because actually what was happening is Elizabeth was scrupulously staying away from those sophisticated investors who were more likely to ask the right questions and to come with experts who would kick the tires. But the question the more narrow question that I'm focused on is, did Silicon Valley learn its lesson here? And until recently, I was a little bit pessimistic about that. But I think potentially that's going to change with the fact that now Elizabeth has been convicted. Sunny's trial just began and should conclude within the next few months. I'm pretty confident he's going to be convicted too. Then Elizabeth will be sentenced in late September. Based on the 4 counts that she was convicted on, I think she's going to do real time. I wouldn't be surprised if she gets 5 to 7 years. And I think that potentially is going to sink in, and it's going to be a deterrent. There are probably a lot of people involved in startups in the Valley who will think twice about going as far as she did with the lies and the exaggeration as a result. I think your question was more about human nature in general. It's hard to do away with greed in a place like Silicon Valley where there is so much money. Even now after the stock market correction, the war in Ukraine, it's sort of cast a pall on the stock market. You still read of these things going on, out there, the sums of money that are being raised by some of these startups, at the valuations that are being achieved. There is still a gusher of money flowing that's available to some of these young people, some of whom, like Elizabeth, are dropouts. And yeah, it's hard not to be blinded by greed.
Hi, I would like to circle back to the question about the inefficiency of the board members. We talked about their age, but if they were younger, do you think they could avoid the mistake they made? For example, the lack of critical thinking on the development process or, on referral validations. If they've been younger, do you think the board members could avoid it? And also, we talked about the Silicon Valley culture. We know, money and technology, but what exactly is the pros and cons of Silicon culture that shape Elizabeth the way she is today? Thank you.
I think age, if some of these board members had been younger, it would have helped. I think what would have helped more is expertise. if some of these board members were in the biotech industry or in the pharmaceutical industry, the medical technology, the medical device industry. I think that sort of representation on the board is what was needed. But I do think age was a factor. Some of these guys were so old and so removed from really, their most productive years that I do think that played a role. Your other question was what is it about Silicon Valley that molded Holmes into who she was? I think, like I said, she was, when she dropped out of Stanford, as young as she was, she knew all about the lore of Silicon Valley. She knew the legend of Larry Ellison and of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all these guys, and she looked up to them. Steve Jobs really became a hero for her. She even, as you know, started dressing like him. There's this other thing, I think, in Silicon Valley, which is the cult of the founder, which is a more recent phenomenon. I think it dates more to the second tech boom, and especially I think it has something to do with Apple becoming as successful as it did, and Steve Jobs in his second incarnation, and Apple becoming as successful as he did. It kind of popularized this myth that there can be a lot of these young, brilliant individuals who can see around corners and do no wrong. And Elizabeth, I think, capitalized on this myth of the founder, this cult of the genius founder. She also capitalized on the appetite that there was for a female, a woman, to succeed on the level that all these men had.
Just very quickly, there was a study done a number of years ago in a publication entitled 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse. One of them is the iconic founder and kind of the cult around that. But this is kind of a poster child of representing a number of those. You might be interested in looking at that article. And the research was that if you see these being present, you're really organizationally kind of setting yourself up for a kind of ethical collapse that you ended up characterizing and telling the story of. Right. Yeah.
I mean, another example to me of the myth and cult of the founder is Elon Musk. He exaggerates and hypes a lot, and his behavior often flirts with the limits of legality. He's gotten into hot water with the SEC more than once, but you could argue his cars do drive. And he is now the richest person in the world. So.
Well, John, we're really at the point of our time this afternoon. We're so deeply honored by the opportunity to be in dialogue with you, to learn from your work. Obviously, the impact of the story compelling in so many ways, but the lessons that it teaches. One of the things that I kept thinking about throughout is, what's the story and how compelling is that? But really, what do we take away from this? What are the lessons that we should learn around culture, organizational life, this question of greed versus rectitude, moral courage, really the importance of truth over dishonesty and obvious fraud, so many different dimensions, and so much to unpack, to learn from the story and from the impact of the story. So thank you so very much. It's such a wonderful opportunity to be with you tonight.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, Professor Pickert and Thies, and of course, Provost Poon and Dean Smith. So as we close the evening, we'd love to celebrate with all of you and celebrating our first LMU Innovation Symposium. We do have a reception in the back, so for our students, please enjoy and connect with Mr. Carreyrou and also with our faculty. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's been great to see you all in person. Thank you.